Hi guys, it is Poetry Thursday and I want to change it up a little bit. Today, instead of talking about an individual poem or poems or poet, I'm going to talk about the 1947 anthology of poems called Dark of the Moon Poems of Fantasy and the Macabre by August Derleth. Absolutely fabulous work. It's a gathering of poems dealing with the monstrous and the macabre, but really it's dealing with themes that poetry's always been concerned about, with the way that dreams spill into consciousness, with the way that inner life is a messy business. Darkness is not always a bad thing. I think of T.S. Eliot saying, "Let the dark come upon you, and that shall be the darkness of God." Exploring that darkness is often a kind of emotional and imaginative authenticity, where the real stuff of the mind is raw and ambivalent and sometimes treads on the dangerous edge of things and is inhabited by its share of monstrous and shares of fierce desires that spill over any attempt to contain them and are weird. Weird tales you don't usually associate with poetry, but in fact, from the very beginning, Weird Tales was instructing its readers in poetry in a number of ways. One thing is it would reprint canonical works of poetry that somehow partook of the Weird Tales or really anticipated the whole Weird Tales ethos. When we encounter Keats's 1820 poem in a 1925 issue of Weird Tales, the context is already a world out of joint, with imagination running at feverish pitch, the unconscious with its demons and wild desires spilling into the everyday, and the expected laws of nature in a bit of a hallucinogenic flux. The flea chasing the dog is just precious, but it's also scary. For in truth, a dog-sized flea might just jump on your face from a football field away. And you think you've met the love of your life in the green foliage at the side of a gurgling brook, and suddenly you're dispossessed from all you were, a grief-besieged wanderer on this spinning earth. Lamia coming at you, all smiles, or a football-sized flea. This is the way the world ends, and this is the fabulous context of a 1925 Weird Tales, and lucky the readers who experienced the Keats poem that way. By the time Derleth prints it in Dark of the Moon, the poem is sandwiched between Johann Wolfgang Goethe's Song of the Most Rending of All Loss, the Earl King, and Thomas Hood's Haunted House Spookfest about how we are never truly home. But in the sense that in a themed anthology, every poem contributes to the whole aesthetic aura of every other poem, I like linking the Keats poem to the Eldridge Dark by the vastly underrated and underread Clark Ashton Smith. The Eldridge Dark. Now as the twilight's doubtful interval closes with night's accomplished certainty, a wizard wind goes crying eerily, and in the glade unsteady shadows crawl, timed to the trees whose voices rear and fall, as with some dreadful witch's ecstasy, flung upward to the dark whence glitters free the crooked moon impendent over all. Twin veils of covering cloud and silence thrown across the movement, and the sound of things make blank the night, till in the broken west the moon's ensanguined blade a while is shown, the night's grown whole again, the shadows rest, gathered beneath a greater shadow's wing. Belle Dans Sans Merci, a ballad. Oh, what can ail thee, night, at arms, alone, and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee,
knight at arms, so haggard and so woe begone. The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her hair, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone she looked at me as she did love and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses four, and there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La Belle Dans Sans Merci hath thee in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing.
August Derleth's involvement with Weird Tales ran so deep that the table of contents for Dark of the Moon is, among other things, a who's who of Weird Tales. H.P. Lovecraft has 4 poems. The extraordinary Clark Ashton Smith has 11 poems. Robert E. Howard has the most in the volume with 13 poems. And one of my favorite, basically unknown Weird Tale authors, Mary Elizabeth Counselman, has 2. When Derleth and Donald Wondrive founded Arkham House in 1939, he even kept up with Weird Tale illustrators. One, Virgil Finlay, had much to do with how Weird Tales introduced its readers to poetry, and Derleth carried many of the lessons learned at Weird Tales into his Arkham House publishing. One of Finlay's many jobs at Weird Tales was to gather quotes from famous poems or plays from the past that anticipate the emerging genre of modern horror. Finlay's role was both brilliant and subtle. Take the quotes and use illustrations to amplify their sense of horror and nudge them towards a Weird Tales aesthetic. We too will stand beside that shrine, occult, withheld, untrod, whose lamps are stirred continually with prayers sent up to God, and see our old prayers granted melt each other like a little cloud. The tonal differences between Rossetti's poem, which is mournful with just a tinge of morbidity, is striking. Finlay's version brings out the dark, desolate, grief-besieged undercurrents in the poem, giving us a hell broth of eternal estrangement. The way he brings the Rossetti into line with a Weird Tales aesthetic is precisely the point. The poem Finlay chooses for the disturbing and grotesque Suicide Chapel cover, painted by Margaret Brundage, is quite fitting. He takes Longfellow's The Skeleton in the Armor. Speak, speak, thou fearful guest, who with thy hollow chest all in rude armor dressed, comest to daunt me. It's a dark poem, but Finlay draws the figure of our own death in very close, for the murderous death figure is standing right in front of us and staring us down. Here Finlay has both painted the cover and illustrated the poem inside.
And ere the tomb throne echoing hath ceased, the blue-eyed vampire sated at her feet smiles bloodily against the leprous moon. Boy, that's something. I love Finley's illustration, and in this case, the weird horror of the poem pretty much speaks for itself. It's the perfect compliment. Talk about your vampiress, who even with mouth dripping blood looks a little bit like a femme fatale. It's the perfect power of bats and mist and graveyard and messy lipstick of dripping blood and femme fatale and moon all interfused. What a fabulous image. It's a Finley cover again. And I have loved Milton all my life, but never did I imagine anything quite this ghoulish until Finley brought it out in it. Hence, loathed melancholy of Cerberus and blackest midnight born in Stygian caves forlorn mongst horrid shapes and shrieks and sights unholy. I love what Finley has done with this. A big and constant point of Weird Tales is that there have been pockets of horror out there all along. Macbeth, for example, is a hell broth of blood that won't stay in the body and constantly is mixing metaphorically with mother's milk. Like Weird Tales, Shakespeare is constantly engaging the most primal of fears. But Finley tugs it out even of relatively innocuous places. In Henry IV, you have I can call spirits from the vasty deep. But Finley gives us spirits that are ghoulish and ferocious and utterly terrifying. Just like Clark Ashton Smith's short poem The Eldritch Dark has a long and vital afterlife in the world of horror and horror poetry, Robert E. Howard's 4-line poem Arkham spills into the genre of horror and fantasy in all sorts of ways. Drowsy and dull with age, the houses blink. On aimless streets, the rat-gnawed years forget. But what inhuman figures leer and slink down the old alleys when the moon has set? Mentioned liking Mary Elizabeth Counselman. One particularly horrific little poem just gives me the shakes. It's Anchidna. Who has seen Anchidna, where the swamp ooze dries, where the swamp things slither in the wan moonrise? Who has seen Anchidna's eyes? Who has heard Anchidna in the scaly guise of black swamp serpent hiss her wind soft sighs? Who has heard Anchidna flies? Who has seen Anchidna with her bright black eyes as her serpent body in the swamp mud lies? Who has seen Anchidna dies? One final thing. If you don't know about August Derleth's Arkham House publishing firm, you should. In its heyday, it published some of the most extraordinary horror and fantasy titles of the last century. Recently, MJ at BookTube conceived the idea of an Occult Detective October, and a number of quite brilliant people at BookTube have jumped on board, including several specialists in the genre. It's going to be a fabulous event. For decades, I specialized in Victorian art and literature, and it amazes me how many of my cultural heroes from that period were fascinated with the idea that the occult and spiritualism would open up new portals of experience and discovery. At the same time, the detective in fiction was finding new ways to lift the veil on surfaced appearance and to get to essential truths invisible to others. The marriage of detective fiction and occult and spiritualist beliefs is fascinating on so many levels. August Derleth's Arkham House gathered and republished many of the key works of occult detective fiction that had appeared only in magazines and pulps or obscure editions. Many of the works that will be discussed in Occult Detective October owe a great deal to Derleth and Arkham House, including my own contribution on the writer Seabury Quinn event. It will be fascinating, fun, and deliciously dark, edgy, devious, strange, weird, and deeply relevant. Thank you for watching. I've included links to the event sponsors below.